My name's Tom Place, this is Chasing Cars, and with me today is a very special concept vehicle. It's called the LF-ZC, and it's not just the reason we're here today, we're also here to talk about the 35th anniversary of Lexus. Lexus, of course, kicked off back in 1989, and while it was primarily designed to target the American market, Australia was actually one of its first customers. They arrived here in Australia in May of 1990, and they brought with them, of course, the iconic first generation LS flagship. Now in today's video, we're going to be taking a bit of a look back at the Lexus brand, and we're also going to be diving into this very special vehicle here and what it signifies for the future of this brand. But before we get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and comment down below if you want to see more content like this.
Chasing Cars, honest reviews of your next car. Brought to you by Budget Direct.
Like so many different vehicle manufacturers, there are really two different timelines that you need to think about when it comes to the future of their drivetrains. The first comes in 2030, and that consists of hybrid, fully electric, and of course plug-in hybrids, which are going to make up all of Lexus's range by that due date. Now, the more serious, fully electric across the range target comes in 2035. The vehicle beside me, the LF-ZC, is really one of the vehicles that I'm excited for. Primarily, it's due to the fact that this is not yet another fully electric SUV. This really strikes out on its own sort of identity. It's a sedan in shape, but it is more of a liftback when you look closely at the design. A production version of this is due to come out in about 2026. And look, it hasn't been locked in for Australia, but the very fact that I'm standing in front of the concept in Australia probably tells you that Lexus is pretty interested in it. Now, before we jump into today's video and have a look at this vehicle more closely, let's first have a look back at the 35 years of Lexus.
The Lexus story, of course, kicked off with the original LS400, a vehicle which channeled the full might of the Toyota Corporation and channeled it into a sedan which really became the new benchmark in its segment. It wasn't long after that Lexus released the SC400 Coupe, which was available with both a V8 or a straight-six engine option, though it wouldn't come to Australia until some years later. It was the ES sedan that was the second model to land in Australia. Based on the Camry, it was a bit of a surprising delight in how comfortable and smooth it was to drive. In 1993, the GS Large sedan would also be released globally, though once again, it wouldn't land in Australia until its second generation. For many though, it was the 1995 LX that really started to get the attentions of Aussies. This was a four-wheel drive which was based on the iconic Land Cruiser, but it offered a bit more of a luxury edge to it, and for those who do a lot of Ks out in the bush, this was seen as really the go-to vehicle. In 1998, the RX Large SUV was born, though once again, it didn't arrive in Australia until 2003. 1999 was a bit of an interesting chapter for Lexus in Australia though. It marked the release of the IS200, which later became the IS250, and it also marked the first 10,000 sales from the brand in its 10 years on sale, a feat that it would double in the next 4 years. For many though, it was the 2005 concept of the LFA that would later become a production vehicle that would be really the standout from the Lexus brand. Featuring a V10 which had a screaming 9,000 RPM redline, just 500 units were sold globally, and 8 of which came to Australia. Lexus would eventually spin off a few more performance vehicles from this brand, and they would come up with the F-Series, named after, of course, the Fuji Speedway where they were developed, and they would create the ISF, RCF, and GSF being key highlights there. It wasn't until 2006 though that the Lexus that we know today started to see signs of life, with the RX and GS releasing hybrid variants. Now Lexus was a little slow to launch its first mid-size SUV in the NX, which first arrived in 2014, but it was an instant hit in Australia and quickly became the brand's best seller locally, though many critics would argue this model didn't really hit its stride until the second generation arrived in 2022. We can't forget about some other highlights along the way though, such as the LC500, which debuted in 2016, and have also seen fully electric Lexus models such as the UX300E and the RZ450E midsize SUV. More recently though, the brand has expanded to new territory in Australia with the more affordable LBX small SUV, the LM People Mover, and the second generation GX four-wheel drive, which is of course based on the new Prado 250 series.
Ever since the Lexus IS was prematurely killed off here in Australia due to some complications with ADRs, I and many others have really felt that there's more space in Lexus's lineup for a sedan like this one to join the ES and the LS on sale. Sedans globally, of course, have been declining in popularity, but they do seem to have an enduring presence in the luxury space, and it's really interesting to see them envisioned as a future vehicle, so they're still going to be a part of our lineup and our lives going forward. Now, this is about 4.7 meters long, and it's about 1.9 meters wide. It's a pretty big thing, and of course, I must stress that this is not the production version, but I definitely think we can expect a number of design cues on this vehicle when it finally does reach the production stage. One area I think is interesting is the fact that we don't actually have a very long bonnet here. On here, the windscreen starts very early on, almost at the center point of the wheel here, or even just slightly over the front axle, which is very interesting indeed. And of course, it gives this beautiful sweeping effect up here. Be interesting to see if that does actually come to production. Now, the wheelbase here is pretty big. It's almost 3 meters long, and of course, that gives you really good backseat space, which is something you really do need for a luxury vehicle. And while we aren't really allowed to sit inside this vehicle today, I'm not really sure it actually even has an inside, we do envision that there's going to be a bit more space in the back of here than you would compared to your traditional combustion vehicle. It's going to have a flatter floor, at least if they package the batteries closely, so hopefully there should be some design benefits in that regard. Now, when it comes to the actual hardware that goes into this new generation of electric vehicles, of course, we don't really know the final details just yet, but Lexus has given us some signs of things that they're expecting to put in this model when it finally comes to production. One of those is prismatic battery cells, which is essentially just a fancy term for using more of the available space inside a given battery pack, which of course is such a big deal when it comes to EVs. Battery density really does matter. It allows us to put more battery cells inside cars and also means that there's less compromise when it comes to interior space, which is a big deal for luxury vehicles. Now, we haven't really been given a specific number on how many kilometers this vehicle in particular is going to be able to travel in its production form, but the official line is that it's going to be about double what we've come to expect from first generation EVs that we see on the road today. So given that most EVs do about 400 to 600 kilometers, I think we can expect something in excess of 1,000 kilometers, which is certainly very exciting for a big country like Australia, where you really do want a dependable vehicle that you can do long distances in easily. Now, prismatic battery cells are a very interesting move that we are seeing across the wider industry, but so are solid-state batteries, and you do wonder why Lexus hasn't just delayed these vehicles just a little bit longer and gone straight for that. Now, the official line is that Toyota/Lexus is looking to introduce solid-state batteries somewhere between 2027 and 2028, and when it comes to solid-state batteries, you're usually better off going with the latter date when it comes to expecting them to actually arrive in production form, so perhaps that's why they've decided to push ahead with this more of a middle ground technology, making the most of what they have. Now, with all this new technology, it's pretty natural to feel cautious of the incoming price rises that come along with it. But one potential saving grace that Lexus is looking to introduce is the idea of gigacasting. We've heard of it most notably. Tesla uses it in a great production scale. But the idea is that these vehicles will be constructed in just 3 separate parts. And that's going to be really great when it comes to things like rigidity and also just like driving performance, because we're not also having a chassis that's compromised as much with big old holes in the front here, like for example with a combustion engine. All very clever stuff. Now, I've just come down next to these huge 21-inch wheels because I want to talk about something interesting, and that's the idea of steer-by-wire, but in production cars. Lexus, of course, has shown off this technology pretty extensively. They had it in their RZ fully electric vehicle, and have actually sampled that vehicle previously, but of course, it's not really in production stage just yet. Now, we have seen it in production form in North America in the Tesla Cybertruck, but steer-by-wire is something that's going to be forming part of the new generation of EVs. Of course, this brings packaging benefits because you don't have a physical steering column. And of course, many people aren't going to be too happy about the fact that they don't have a physical connection between themselves and the wheels. But we are really starting to see that trickle down with things like brakes and accelerators for years and years. So I guess it was just really a matter of time before it affected the steering. And Lexus does argue that this is going to result in, believe it or not, more natural feeling steering that's also able to be changed in different driving situations. Sounds like a cool idea, but we're going to wait and see what it's like to actually drive before we draw an official opinion on it. Now, I said before that this car is a sedan in nature, and that is for the most part fairly true. And I say that it's fairly true because there are some other ingredients here from other vehicles, and we can see that by just looking at the roofline. See, when we come to the rear passenger compartment here, most sedans would come down pretty sharply, and unfortunately that does mean that you're not going to have too great of a time when it comes to headroom, at least when you're initially ducking under the door when you're getting in. And having this nice straight line here, I think is really encouraging, and of course it all forms part of the luxury experience. Who wants a car that you have to duck and weave? And I think it's something that could actually be to the advantage of the sedan body shape, which of course is always seen as being the less practical body style. But that's just one little tidbit that could make life just a little bit nicer.
There is talk that the LF-ZC concept could form the basis of the next generation ES, which would make sense given that current generation is due for replacement, and factors such as a spacious back seat would be considered a key asset for that model.
The wheels are clearly in motion to fully electrify Lexus's lineup, and I'm very excited to see the results of that in the coming years. For now though, they very much have their feet in both camps. On one hand, we have the LBX Rizzo RR coming to Australia next year. It's just raw savagery from a combustion engine. It's something we don't always see from Lexus, but when we do, it's often very, very good indeed. There's also been electrification in segments which has been pretty much declared unfeasible previously. I'm talking about your off-road four-wheel drives. The GX, which is of course the sibling to the Prado, remains under consideration for a hybrid drivetrain in Australia, and I really do think that would be a good addition to the lineup. There is of course now a hybrid version of the LX's drivetrain as well, and a version of that of course exists in the Toyota Tundra. So for me, it would just make sense if they adopted that drivetrain inside their biggest and baddest large SUV. But having seen what we've seen here today, are we encouraged by the production version of this concept to come? Well, I would say very much yes so. Simple things, for example, like the rear roof line, which doesn't make the backseat a miserable place to be, and also the idea of doing 1,000 kilometers on a single charge. These are great numbers, and we'd really love to see them come to fruition in the real world. I think the most disappointing thing about this vehicle is the fact that we don't really have a competitor in this space from Lexus just yet. And by the time it arrives in 2026, and who knows when it's going to arrive in Australia, the competition may have moved on just that bit more. And you've got to wonder, with rivals from China doing some really great work in this space and producing some incredible numbers and some genuinely desirable vehicles out there on top of competitors like Mercedes-Benz and BMW already competing in the space, if Lexus isn't quite moving fast enough. However, when I take a look back at what has made Lexus great over the years, it's never really been about chasing the big numbers and being first and setting the absolute benchmark when it comes to performance figures and things like that. The brilliance of Lexus has always come in the execution, and it's something that we've also seen in our Lexus RX long-term that we very sadly handed back some time ago now. Basic things like having really good seats, a UI that just makes sense, and a car that you want to get in and drive and not be annoyed by, when a lot of its competitors are still fussing about and not really nailing the brief from the get-go. To me, that is the Lexus difference, and as we're seeing just such a huge field of EVs out there boasting 1 million horsepower and all these big claims, many of which don't really come to fruition, it'll be interesting to see if this emerges as more of a quiet success story, which is actually the car that you want to buy rather than just the flashy thing that stands out the most. But anyway, those are just my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments down below, and don't forget to subscribe and like if you want more. But for now, that's all. Thank you for watching Chasing Cars.